The empty horizon stretched out before Yates Kincaid as he rode slowly toward home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the Montana territory. It was the autumn of 1879, and the first hints of winter whispered in the evening air. 3 years had passed since he'd buried his wife and infant son, victims of a fever that had swept through their small town of Pine Creek, leaving his heart as barren as the landscape around him. Yates pulled his horse to a stop at the crest of the hill overlooking his property. The 2-story cabin he'd built with his own hands stood quiet against the backdrop of pine trees, smoke curling from the chimney where he'd left a small fire burning that morning. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, fat and healthy after a summer of good grass. By all accounts, he was a successful rancher, but success felt hollow when there was no one to share it with. As he urged his horse forward, something caught his eye movement near his porch that shouldn't be there. Yates tensed, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Times had been relatively peaceful lately, but the memory of raids and robberies lingered in this untamed land. Drawing closer, he made out a huddled figure on his porch steps. A woman, her dress tattered and dirty, clutching something to her chest. The bundle in her arms moved, and Yates realized with a start that it was a baby. He approached cautiously, dismounting a few yards away. "Madam," he called, his voice rough from disuse, "you all right?" The woman's head jerked up, revealing a face that might have been beautiful if not for the gauntness of starvation and the fear in her eyes. She struggled to her feet, clutching the infant protectively. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just needed to rest. We'll be moving on." Yates took in her condition with one sweeping glance: the worn boots, the thin dress inappropriate for the cooling weather, the hollow cheeks and desperate eyes. The baby whimpered, a weak sound that twisted something inside his chest. "Where are you headed?" he asked, tying his horse to the post. "West," she replied vaguely, taking a step back. "I have family in Oregon." It was an obvious lie. Oregon was hundreds of miles away, an impossible journey on foot with a baby, especially with winter approaching. "I'm Yates Kincaid," he said, removing his hat. "This is my ranch. And you look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to sleep." The woman hesitated, clearly weighing her desperation against her fear of a stranger. The baby's cry grew more insistent, and Yates saw her resolve crumble. "I'm Nora," she said finally. "Nora Dawson, and this is Emma." Yates nodded, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "Come inside, Mrs. Dawson. There's stew on the stove and fresh milk in the cellar for the little one." "It's Miss," she corrected quietly. "And thank you, Mr. Kincaid, but I can't pay you." "Wasn't asking for payment," he replied, holding the door open. "Just seems the Christian thing to do." The warmth of the cabin enveloped them as they stepped inside. Yates moved efficiently around the kitchen, ladling thick beef stew into a bowl while Nora sank gratefully into a chair, the baby still clutched to her chest. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, placing the steaming bowl before her. Nora stared at the food with undisguised hunger. "Yesterday morning, some berries we found along the road," Yates frowned, "and the baby, I've been nursing her, but..." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't have enough milk anymore, she's hungry all the time." "Let me get that milk," Yates said, heading for the cellar. When he returned with a small jug, he found Nora sobbing silently, one hand covering her mouth to muffle the sound. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to do. Her father promised to marry me, but when he found out I was with child, he disappeared. My parents disowned me. I've been working in a boarding house in Helena, but the owner's wife didn't want a baby disturbing the guests." Yates warmed some milk in a small pan, then poured it into a bottle he hadn't touched in 3 years. He'd kept it along with all of his son's things, unable to part with the reminders of what he'd lost. "Here," he said, handing her the bottle. "She needs this more than stew right now." Nora accepted it gratefully, offering it to her daughter, who began to suckle eagerly. For the first time, Yates got a good look at the child, no more than 4 or 5 months old, with wisps of dark hair and her mother's blue eyes. "Eat," he encouraged Nora, nodding toward the untouched stew. You need your strength too. As Nora ate and fed her baby, Yates built up the fire and prepared the small bedroom off the kitchen. It had been a sewing room for his wife, but it would serve well enough for a mother and child. You can stay here tonight, he said when he returned. Tomorrow we can figure out what's next. Nora looked up, her face a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Why are you helping us? Yates considered her question seriously. Because there was a time when no one helped me, and I swore if I ever saw someone in need, I wouldn't turn away. The truth was more complicated. The sight of a motherless child had awakened memories and emotions he'd tried to bury alongside his family. But that wasn't something to burden a desperate young woman with on their first meeting. The bedroom's ready when you are, he said instead. I'll be upstairs if you need anything. That night, Yates lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of life in his home, the gentle creak of floorboards as Nora walked the baby, the soft murmur of her voice singing a lullaby. It had been so long since his house had held anything but silence and ghosts. Morning brought a sense of purpose Yates hadn't felt in years. He rose early, milking the cow before his guests awoke. When Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway, Emma on her hip, he already had coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven. Good morning, he said, nodding toward the table. Sit, breakfast will be ready soon. Mr. Kincaid, Nora began hesitantly, you've been very kind, but we should be moving on. I don't want to impose. Yates slid eggs onto a plate. And where exactly will you go? Winter's coming. You can't travel with a baby in the snow. I'll find work in town, she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. Pine Creek's a small place, Yates replied. Not much work for a single woman with a child. He placed the plate in front of her. I've been thinking. I could use help around here. The house needs tending, and I'm away with the cattle more than I'd like. You could stay, earn your keep until spring. Nora's eyes widened with surprise and suspicion. What exactly would you expect in return, Mr. Kincaid? Yates understood her meaning immediately and stepped back, hands raised. Nothing improper, Miss Dawson. You'd have the bedroom downstairs. I'd stay upstairs. I need a housekeeper, Nada. He cleared his throat. I'm offering honest work and a roof over your heads, that's all. Nora studied him, searching for deceit. Finding none, she nodded slowly. Until spring, she agreed. Then we'll reassess. Fair enough, Yates said, returning to the stove. Eat your breakfast before it gets cold. The days fell into a rhythm. Yates worked the ranch from dawn to dusk, while Nora brought order back to a house that had seen little care since his wife died. She was a good cook and a diligent worker, and Emma flourished under the stability of regular meals and warm shelter. Evenings found them sharing quiet meals, their conversation gradually evolving from awkward politeness to genuine interest. Yates learned that Nora had been a schoolteacher before her pregnancy forced her to leave her position. She was well-read and intelligent, with opinions on everything from politics to poetry. For her part, Nora discovered that beneath Yates's gruff exterior was a thoughtful man who'd read every book in his small library multiple times. He played the harmonica beautifully and carved intricate wooden animals that delighted Emma as she grew more alert and engaged with the world around her. As October turned to November and the first snow blanketed the land, Yates found himself looking forward to returning to the house each evening. The warm glow of lamplight in the windows and the smell of cooking food welcomed him home. Sometimes he'd pause before entering, savoring the moment and trying to ignore the knowledge that it was temporary. One evening, as they sat before the fire after supper, Emma asleep in a cradle Yates had built, Nora finally asked the question he'd been dreading. You had a family once, didn't you? I found the toys in the attic when I was cleaning. Yates stared into the flames. A wife, Sarah, and a son, Samuel. They died of typhoid 3 years ago. Nora's hand reached out, covering his. I'm sorry, is that why you helped us? Maybe, he admitted. But not in the way you might think. I'm not looking to replace them. I know, she said softly. Loss leaves holes that can't be filled with substitutes, but perhaps new joy can exist alongside the sorrow. Her insight surprised him, and for the first time, Yates allowed himself to really look at her not as a charity case or a temporary helper, but as a woman. The weeks of good food and rest had restored her beauty. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth, her blue eyes bright in the firelight, her dark blonde hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. "You're staring, Mr. Kincaid," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "Yates," he corrected. "After all this time, I think you can call me Yates." "Yates," she repeated, and something in the way she said his name made his heart beat faster. The moment was broken by Emma's cry. Nora withdrew her hand and rose to tend to her daughter, leaving Yates to wonder what had just passed between them. Winter deepened, and the ranch became an island in a sea of white. They were snowed in for days at a time, but the larder was full, the woodpile high, and the house warm against the howling wind. Yates taught Nora to play checkers and whist. She read aloud from his books in the evenings while he carved toys for Emma. The baby grew stronger daily, learning to sit up and reaching for toys with determined little hands. Her first tooth appeared just before Christmas, and she began babbling syllables that sometimes sounded suspiciously like "ya" when Yates entered the room. "She's trying to say your name," Nora remarked one morning as Emma reached eagerly for him. Without thinking, Yates lifted the child into his arms. "Is that right, little one? You calling for me?" Emma grabbed his beard with a delighted gurgle, and something in Yates's chest that had been frozen for 3 years began to thaw. For Christmas, he surprised Nora with fabric for a new dress and a silver locket he'd bought from the mercantile in town during a brief break in the weather. For Emma, he'd carved a set of wooden animals: a cow, a horse, a bear, and a rabbit. Nora presented him with a new scarf she'd knitted in secret and a fresh baked apple pie. They shared a special dinner, and afterward, with Emma asleep in her cradle, they sat close together before the fire, the comfortable silence broken only by the crackling flames. "Thank you," Nora said suddenly, "not just for Christmas, but for everything. You saved our lives, Yates." "You've brought life back to this house," he replied honestly. "That's worth more than room and board." Their eyes met, and the tension that had been building between them for weeks suddenly crystallized. Yates leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. But Nora met him halfway, her lips soft against his in a kiss that started gentle and quickly deepened with unexpected hunger. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Nora's cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide with surprise at her own boldness. "I should check on Emma," she whispered, rising quickly and disappearing into her room. Yates remained by the fire, his thoughts in turmoil. He hadn't meant for this to happen, hadn't allowed himself to even consider the possibility. But now that it had, he couldn't deny the feelings that had been growing since that first night she'd appeared on his porch. The next morning brought awkwardness. Nora avoided his eyes over breakfast, and Yates found excuses to stay busy with chores. By evening, the tension was unbearable. "About last night," he began as they cleared the supper dishes. "It was Christmas," Nora interrupted. "People get carried away at Christmas. We needn't speak of it again." Yates set down the plate he was holding. "Is that what you want, to pretend it didn't happen?" Nora stared at the dishwater, her hands still. "What I want doesn't matter much, does it? Spring will come and Emma and I will move on as agreed. What if I asked you to stay?" The words left his mouth before he could consider them fully. She looked up, surprise and wariness battling in her expression. "As your housekeeper?" "No," Yates said firmly, "not as my housekeeper." "Then as what?" she challenged, turning to face him fully. It was Yates's turn to hesitate. He was a practical man, not given to impulsive declarations, but the thought of this woman and her child leaving come spring had become increasingly unbearable. "I don't rightly know yet," he admitted, "but I'd like the chance to figure it out, if you're willing." Nora studied him for a long moment. "I have Emma to consider. I can't afford mistakes." "I understand that. I'm not asking for promises, just time," she nodded slowly. "Time we have, at least until the snow melts." January brought a brutal cold snap that kept them indoors for nearly 2 weeks. In the enforced intimacy, they learned each other's habits and moods. Yates discovered that Nora hummed when she was content and bit her lip when she was worried. Nora found that Yates spoke little in the mornings but became more talkative as the day progressed. They established new patterns, Yates taking Emma for an hour each evening so Nora could have time to herself, Nora leaving coffee warming for him when he went out to check on the livestock in the pre-dawn darkness. Small kindnesses and considerations that spoke louder than words. There were more kisses, each less hesitant than the last. Hands that lingered during the passing of a plate or the stoking of a fire. But both were careful to maintain boundaries, aware of the uncertain future and the child who depended on their good judgment. In February, Emma took her first wobbly steps across the kitchen floor, launching herself from Nora's arms to Yates's waiting hands. The look they shared over the baby's head held more than joy at her milestone, it held the recognition of what they were becoming. A family. That night after Emma was asleep, Nora found Yates on the porch, staring at the star-filled sky. "It's too cold to be out here," she scolded gently, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "Just needed to clear my head," he replied, making room for her beside him. Nora settled next to him, sharing the blanket. "What's troubling you?" Yates was silent for a long moment. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he finally said. "After Sarah and Samuel died, I figured that part of me was dead too, but then you and Emma came along. And—" she prompted when he fell silent. "And I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared of losing again, scared of not being good enough, scared you'll wake up one morning and realize you could do better than a rough rancher with too many ghosts." Nora's hand found his. "I was scared too. Scared of trusting again after Emma's father abandoned us, scared of depending on anyone." She turned to face him. "But I'm not scared anymore, Yates, not of you," he cupped her face gently. "I love you, Nora, you and Emma both." "I know it hasn't been long, time isn't always the measure," she interrupted. "Sometimes it's what happens in that time that matters." Her eyes shone in the moonlight. "I love you too." The kiss they shared was different from the others, a promise rather than a question. "Marry me," Yates whispered against her lips. "Stay here, not until spring, but for good. Let me be a father to Emma. Let me love you both for the rest of my days." Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered back. "Yes to all of it." They were married in March by the circuit preacher who stopped in Pine Creek every 6 weeks. The ceremony was small, just a few neighbors and friends from town as witnesses. Emma, now nearly a year old, watched with wide eyes from the arms of Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife. Nora wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, with wildflowers in her hair. Yates had never seen anything more beautiful than her smile as she promised to be his wife. That night, after putting Emma to bed in what was now officially her nursery, they came together as husband and wife in the upstairs bedroom that was no longer just Yates's, but theirs. Their lovemaking was tender and passionate by turns, the culmination of months of growing affection and desire. Afterward, as Nora lay in his arms, Yates marveled at how completely his life had changed in the span of half a year. From empty silence to a house filled with a woman's laughter and a baby's cries. From loneliness to love. "What are you thinking about?" Nora asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "How lucky I am," he replied honestly. "How close I came to missing this if you hadn't stopped at my porch that day." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I was afraid you'd turn us away, or worse." "Thank God you took the chance," Yates said, pulling her closer. Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and greening hills. The cattle were turned out to pasture, and Yates hired 2 hands to help with the increased workload. The ranch prospered under his renewed energy and purpose. Nora planted a garden behind the house and started teaching Emma her letters, though the child was more interested in the chickens Yates had bought at her insistence. They added a room to the house, anticipating the family's growth. In June, Nora confirmed what Yates had begun to suspect: she was expecting a child. The news filled him with both joy and terror. The memory of losing Sarah in childbirth haunted him, but Nora's confidence and the town's new doctor helped ease his fears. "This baby will have something wonderful that Emma didn't have at first," Nora told him one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching Emma chase fireflies in the yard. "What's that?" Yates asked, his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "A father who's been there from the beginning," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "A man who will love it unconditionally, just as you've loved Emma." It was true. Yates couldn't imagine loving the child Nora carried any more than he loved the little girl who now called him Papa, with complete trust and adoration. Biology mattered less than the bond they'd formed in those winter months when they'd become a family. The baby, a boy they named James, was born on a snowy January night almost exactly a year after Yates had proposed. He came into the world with a lusty cry that announced his healthy lungs to everyone in the house. 2-year-old Emma, allowed to stay up for the occasion, peered at her brother with solemn curiosity before declaring, "Baby loud." As Yates held his son while Nora rested, he felt the circle of his life complete itself. The losses would always be there. Sarah and Samuel remained in his heart. But now that space had expanded to include Nora, Emma, and James, his family. His second chance. 5 years later, the Kincaid Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the territory. The house had expanded to accommodate 2 more children, twins Sarah and Samuel, named in memory of those Yates had lost. Emma, now 7, was the proud big sister, helping with the younger ones and showing an aptitude for horses that delighted her father. Nora had established a small school on the ranch, teaching not only their children but those of the ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. Her reputation as an educator brought families to the area, and the community grew around them. On the anniversary of the day Nora had appeared on his porch, Yates always made a point of taking her back to that spot at sunset. It had become their tradition, a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought them together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped here that day?" he asked as they stood hand in hand, watching the sun sink below the mountains. Nora shook her head. "I was at the end of my rope, Yates. I had nowhere else to go. This wasn't chance, it was providence." From the house came the sound of children's laughter and the barking of the dog. Lights glowed in the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney. It was everything Yates had thought lost to him forever. "Well, whatever brought you to my door," he said, pulling her close. "I thank God for it every day. You made this house a home again, Nora. You and Emma saved me as surely as I saved you." "We saved each other," she corrected, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "And we keep on saving each other every day." As they walked back to the house, arms around each other, Yates reflected on the strange turns life could take. How the deepest sorrow could eventually lead to the greatest joy. How an act of simple kindness opening his door to a starving woman and her baby had filled not just his house but his heart. The children rushed to meet them at the door, clamoring for attention. Yates lifted the twins, one in each arm, while Emma took her mother's hand, already talking about the story she'd been reading. The noise and chaos were so different from the silence that had once filled these rooms. That night, with the children asleep and the house quiet once more, Yates and Nora sat before the fire just as they had that first Christmas. But now they were surrounded by the evidence of their life together: Emma's schoolbooks on the table, the twins' toys scattered across the rug, James's boots by the door. "Happy?" Yates asked, though he knew the answer. Nora's smile was all the response he needed, but she gave him words too. "Completely, you. More than I ever thought possible," he replied truthfully. "More than I deserve." "Love isn't about deserving," Nora said, settling against him as the fire burned low. "It's about recognizing when it's offered and being brave enough to accept it." As Yates held his wife in the home they'd built together, he silently thanked whatever fate or divine intervention had guided Nora to his door on that autumn evening. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now overflowed with life, and the heart that had been broken was now healed stronger at the mended places, just like the family they had forged from separate sorrows into shared joy.